The stage lights dimmed, a giant screen flickered to life, and there he was, a young man in a black suit, eyes blazing with conviction, standing before thousands. He wasn't just unveiling a machine, he was unveiling the future. The Macintosh spoke its first words. "Hello, I'm Macintosh." And the crowd erupted. In that moment, Steve Jobs looked untouchable. A prophet of technology, a man who had bent the future to his will. But what the world didn't know was that only a year later, this same man would be cast out of his own kingdom. The visionary who had built Apple from a garage would be forced to walk away in humiliation, stripped of power, betrayed by the very people he had brought in to help him. This is not just the story of a company. It is the story of a man who was broken, discarded, and left wandering in the wilderness, only to return stronger, sharper, and more dangerous than ever. This is the story of Steve Jobs, fired from his own company. Steve Jobs' life began far from the spotlight. Born in 1955 and adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, he grew up in Mountain View, California, a place that would soon become the heart of Silicon Valley. His childhood was restless. He was curious, rebellious, and endlessly fascinated by how things worked. He tore apart radios, tinkered with circuits, and spent hours in the garage with his father, learning how to build and repair. But Jobs was never just a technician. He was a dreamer. At Reed College, he dropped out after only one semester, but he didn't leave. He audited classes that fascinated him: calligraphy, design, philosophy. He wandered barefoot across campus, slept on friends' floors, and ate free meals at the Hare Krishna temple. He experimented with LSD, explored Zen Buddhism, and searched for meaning. These experiences, strange as they seemed, would later shape his obsession with simplicity, beauty, and clarity in design. In 1976, Jobs and his friend Steve Wozniak built the first Apple computer in his parents' garage. It was a crude wooden box with a keyboard and circuit board, but it was revolutionary. They sold it to hobbyists, then to local stores, and soon Apple Computer was born. Jobs was only 21. Within a few years, Apple went public, and Jobs became a multi-millionaire. He was young, brash, and utterly convinced that he was destined to change the world. The Apple II became a massive success, one of the first personal computers to reach the mainstream. But Jobs wasn't satisfied. He wanted something more. A computer that wasn't just functional, but beautiful. A computer that felt alive. That dream became the Macintosh. The launch in 1984 was pure theater. Jobs unveiled it like a magician, revealing his greatest trick. The Macintosh wasn't just a machine. It was personality, creativity, rebellion in a box. The famous 1984 commercial declared that Apple would save humanity from conformity. Jobs was hailed as a genius, a visionary, the face of a new digital age. But behind the curtain, cracks were forming. Jobs was brilliant, but he was also mercurial. He demanded perfection, screamed at employees, and pushed people to their breaking point. The Macintosh, though iconic, was expensive and struggled in the market. Sales lagged. The board grew nervous, and the man Jobs had recruited as CEO, John Scully, the marketing wizard from Pepsi, began to see Jobs as a liability. The clash was inevitable. Jobs wanted to push forward with bold, risky ideas. Scully wanted stability, profitability, control. The board sided with Scully, and in 1985, the unthinkable happened. Steve Jobs was stripped of his responsibilities. He was effectively fired from the company he had built with his own hands. He was only 30 years old. For Jobs, it was devastation. He later described it as a public humiliation, like being punched in the stomach. Everything he had poured his soul into was gone. The press mocked him. Former colleagues turned their backs. The boy wonder of Silicon Valley had fallen. But here's the thing about Steve Jobs. He was not built to quit. In the ashes of his defeat, he began to rebuild. He walked away from Apple in 1985 with nothing but his pride and his ideas. For a man who had once been hailed as the golden boy of Silicon Valley, it was a brutal fall. But Steve Jobs was not the kind of man who disappeared quietly. He was restless, burning with energy, and determined to prove that his best work was still ahead of him. He founded a new company called NeXT. The vision was bold, to build the most advanced computer the world had ever seen. Sleek, powerful, designed for universities and scientists, the NeXT machine was a marvel of engineering. Its black magnesium cube looked like something from the future. The software was elegant, years ahead of its time. But there was a problem. It was too expensive, too niche, and too far ahead of the market. NeXT never became a commercial success. Yet failure has a strange way of planting seeds. The operating system NeXT created would one day become the foundation of Apple's future. What looked like a dead end was, in truth, a detour toward destiny. At the same time, Jobs made another gamble. He bought a small graphics division from George Lucas, a company that specialized in computer animation. Jobs renamed it Pixar. At first, it seemed like a side project, a distraction, but Pixar would go on to create Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film. It was a global phenomenon. Pixar didn't just make movies, it reinvented them. And Steve Jobs, the man who had been cast out of Apple, suddenly found himself at the center of a new revolution. Meanwhile, Apple was crumbling. Without Jobs, the company lost its soul. Products flopped, innovation stalled. Competitors surged ahead. By the mid-1990s, Apple was on the brink of bankruptcy. The company that Jobs had built in his garage was gasping for air. And then, in a twist of fate, Apple turned back to the man it had once rejected. In 1997, Apple acquired NeXT, bringing Steve Jobs back into the fold. He returned not as the reckless young rebel, but as a seasoned leader who had been tempered by failure. His comeback was electric. Jobs walked into Apple's headquarters and began cutting through the chaos. He slashed bloated product lines, killed off projects that had no future, and focused the company on a single principle: simplicity. He believed that technology should not be complicated, it should be beautiful. He demanded elegance, clarity, and perfection. The results were staggering. In 1998, Apple unveiled the iMac, a colorful, translucent computer that looked like nothing else on the market. It was playful, approachable, and instantly iconic. The iMac saved Apple, but Jobs was just getting started. Next came the iPod, then iTunes, then the iPhone, then the iPad. Each product was not just a device, but a cultural event. Jobs didn't just sell technology, he sold dreams. He turned Apple into the most valuable company in the world. The man who had once been fired from Apple had returned to make it unstoppable. But even as he stood at the peak of his power, Jobs faced his greatest personal battle. In 2003, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He fought it with the same intensity he brought to his work, but the disease would eventually claim his life in 2011. Yet even in death, his influence endures. Steve Jobs once said, "Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me." The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. That is the essence of the story. He was humiliated, cast aside, broken, but he turned that pain into power. He built NeXT, he built Pixar, he returned to Apple, and he changed the world. From a garage in California to the heights of Silicon Valley, from exile to triumph, Steve Jobs' journey is proof that sometimes the greatest failure is the seed of the greatest success. This is the story of Steve Jobs, fired from his own company, reborn as the man who would change everything.